Hey guys, my name is Brian Nichols, and I'm going to discuss the gait development from the four different stages from early childhood all the way to the older adulthood. So, a quick little overview. I'm going to talk about the theories and principles related to each of those four stages. Talk about any major changes from the early childhood through the older adult. I'm going to try to identify at least one common gait abnormality and then any physical or perceptual constraints at each of the stages. All right, so let's get started. So, in early childhood, we have the Nichols model, which Newell suggested that movements arise from the interaction of the organism, the environment in which the movement occurs, and the task to be undertaken. As we've learned from the text, Haywood and Getchell, environment plays a huge role in development, especially for infants up to the age of 6 months. Apart from environment, intrinsic factors can have a great influence on prenatal growth, even in relative protected environment of the womb. Because of this, environmental factors play a huge role during periods of rapid growth. Early diet is particularly important extrinsic influence, as it was during prenatal nourishment. In a study by Dutis, Jadot, Hoffman, and Mall in 2010, they observed that Generation R infants who were breastfed exclusively until 6 months of age had a lower risk of infection than those infants who were exclusively breastfed until 4 months of age. Continuing with my theme of environmental factors, in my opinion, I think that parents have the most influence on a child's development. For example, if a mother or father of the baby of a 1 month old, um, in the video that we'll show you or that I'll link to shortly, um, never gave the baby its time on its back and front to develop the strength and muscularity to eventually roll over, then the development would be lacking. Okay, so apart from the parental involvement, socioeconomics plays a huge role, according to Duncan, because of obviously the status of the child growing up and whatnot. That's going to affect their developmental process. So for example, if you have enough money to have a sitter and all that kind of stuff, obviously you're going to have a faster development than a single working mom who doesn't have time because she's working so much or whatever. Um, Another factor would be perception or visual acuity. This plays a huge role. I think in a study they've shown that infants just as young as 5 days can actually recognize their mom's faces. So while their eyes and ears are still developing, that definitely plays a role on gait development. And then children also follow, or children and all the way through later adulthood follow the sigmoid pattern, which is that typical pattern of growth. Um, and that or any variations, I'm sorry, of that growth pattern are typically on an individual level and not as a society as a whole. Okay, so let's talk about the early childhood gait. So in a toddler's gait, what you'll see is a very wide base of support. You'll see that there's a shorter stride length. You won't see very much arm swing. In fact, their arms will tend to be raised to balance in what's called a high guard. And then the initial contact slash loading response, you'll usually see like a mid-foot strike or a flat foot planting, according to Whitting and Rugg, 2012. And then the mid stance is usually shortened as well as a terminal stance. And then the pre-swing initial swing is shortened almost in front of the body. Then the initial swing slash mid swing is usually shortened as well. And then late mid swing to terminal swing is shortened. So if you've ever seen a 1-year-old wobble around and observe their gait or the walking cycle, it doesn't quite resemble that of an adult. Like I said, they usually have a wider stance, a rapid cadence, and short steps. In fact, until the age of 3, kids don't display clear adult walking patterns, according to children'shospital.org. So let's talk about some common gait abnormalities. So during a child's first few walking years, They may have obvious gait abnormalities, disturbances in what is considered the normal walking gait for that age group. So the most common type of gait abnormality is in-toeing or out-toeing, limping, or toe walking. Many gait disturbances are common and correct themselves on their own. And then according to childrenshospital.org, gait disturbances rarely require medical assistance. However, for children with developing issues, such as developmental issues such as Down syndrome, one intervention could be to promote the early onset of treadmill walking just to observe their gait. All right, so let's talk about childhood and childhood gait. So if you look, perception is usually one of the biggest factors, and that takes place between the ages of 3 and 13. Really, up until 13, the audio and visual skills are still being developed. Auditory perception is pretty big, as well as visual development. This leads to motion perception. Children between 3 and 4 can learn directional extremes, such as high and low, according to Haywood and Getchell. And this is also affects their spatial awareness. All right, so let's talk about their gait as it relates. So their base of support is usually about shoulder width, so it's narrower than a toddler's gait. It's pretty similar to an adult gait, but their stride length is usually shorter. They usually have a little bit of arm swing. It's definitely not fixed like a toddler would be. And then their initial contact is usually front foot or toe planting. You see a lot of the toe instead of a heel strike like a normal gait would be, or mid foot strike. Their mid stance is usually normal, but their terminal stance is somewhat shortened, as well as the pre-swing initial swing, the initial swing mid swing, and then the late mid swing terminal swing. Those are usually shortened as compared to an adult. So some common abnormalities of gait in children would be Trendelenburg's gait. This results from hip adductor muscles weaken or having hip pain while weight bearing on the iliolateral side. The pelvis drops on the contralateral side rather than rising as normal. With bilateral hip disease, this leads to a waddling or rolling sailor is what it's called. Gait of the hips, knees, and feet externally rotated. This is according to parent.info. I'm sorry. Femoral tension is also pretty common in in-turning or out-turning in a child's upper leg bone. This is referred to as bowing, and it's usually apparent in a child between the ages of 5 and 6. However, the condition can improve without treatment. In-toeing from femoral torsion becomes worse between 2 and 4 years of age. So consider surgery in a child who's older than 9 and to have a very severe cause of a lot of tripping and unusual gait. Children with bow legs or knock knees usually straightens out as the child grows. A wide range of knee alignment is normal in young children. Special shoes and wedges don't help really either condition. Okay, next let's talk about adulthood. So maturation usually stops in the early 20s as adolescence ends. And so your audio, visual, motion, and spatial awareness should all be fully developed by this time. And maturation is it connotates progression towards physical maturity, which is the state of optimal function and integration of the body's systems, and as well as the ability to reproduce. If we take a look at the adulthood gait, an adult's gait is usually about shoulder width apart. The stride length is usually longer than that of a toddler and a child. There's usually very minimal arm swing. It's not fixed to the side, to one side or the other. And the initial contact loading response is usually heel strike. Sometimes you'll see midfoot, but typically heel strike. And then mid stance is a normal mid stance, meaning that it's balanced compared to a child or toddler. And terminal stance is usually an extended terminal stance, meaning we stay on that leg longer compared to a child or a toddler. And then pre-swing initial swing is usually greater compared to a toddler or child. And then initial swing, mid-swing is also greater compared to a toddler or child. And then lastly, the mid-swing or terminal swing is usually greater as well. So some abnormalities in adults, a gait would be an adult with cerebral palsy, which can take 3 different forms typically. That is independence, semi-independence, or total dependence, according to cerebralpalsy.org. With cerebral palsy, you'll note that plantar flexion during gait instead of both dorsi and plantar inflection, and less knee flexion than normal gait. Okay, so let's talk about the older adulthood, or the process of aging. So one important factor in aging is bone composition, because bones can change over a lifespan. Bone loss with aging occurs both in men and women, as it relates to changes in certain hormone levels, deficiencies, and then decreased exercise. Next important one is muscularity, or muscle mass. After the age of 50, individuals begin to lose muscle mass at a greater rate. You also have a decline in your nervous system. But what they found is that with regular vigorous exercise, you can maintain a level of blood flow to the brain, which lessens the loss of dendrites. It stimulates neurogenesis and promotes new synaptic connections. These effects can also improve cognitive function in older adulthood, according to Haywood and Getchell. And then falls are really big with the older adults, because these can really affect gait and all sorts of cause other health problems. And despite the extensive research, falls in older people contribute to major health problems, according to Mackey in 1997. Okay, so let's talk about the older adult gait. In the video, you'll see that the base of support is about the same. It's about shoulder width apart. There really isn't much change. But the stride length is greatly reduced, especially in this example. You'll also see an increased toe out on the right leg, and then a toe in on the left leg at approximately 3 to 5 degrees. And you also see reduced degree in ankle extension. So the arm swing is almost none on the left arm, but it's greater on the right arm to try to increase motion and preserve motion. At the initial contact and loading response, you'll see like an anterior lean toe strike, and then mid stance is reduced. The terminal stance is definitely shortened. And then pre-swing, initial swing is definitely shortened. It's short steps, similar to a toddler, but it's a slower cadence than a toddler, but they're definitely short steps. Initial swing, mid-swing is shortened, and then mid-swing, late mid-swing, and terminal swing is also shortened. Okay, so some older adulthood gait abnormalities. One would be neuropathic gait, where the foot or the dorsiflexors are weak, and so the patient has to high step in an attempt to avoid dragging the toe on the ground. Discussed the theories and principles related to each of the 4 stages, which is the early childhood, adult, and the older adult. We've also discussed some of the major changes in gait between the early childhood all the way through the older adulthood. I identified some common gait abnormalities at each of the stages. And then I also talked about some of the physical and perceptual constraints at each stage. Hope you enjoyed the presentation. Thank you.